Hi, welcome to the World Wellness Show. I'm Trish Gleason, and today we have with us Dr. Jarrod Sadulski and Ali Hopper to discuss with you and help you in preventing human trafficking around the world. Welcome, Dr. Sadulski. How are you?
Doing good. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. You've got such a vast background. I'm going to let you introduce yourself in just a minute. And Ali Hopper, thank you for coming. We're happy to have you as well.
Thank you for having us, Trish.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Jarrod, please go ahead and tell everybody about your vast background. And then I've got a few great questions to ask you about human trafficking and how we can help.
Okay. Thank you, Trish. So after 26 years of federal law enforcement, where I was involved in counter trafficking, coming from outside of the United States into the United States. Following that career, I've gotten involved as a criminologist, where I've spent time on the border on both sides, between Mexico and the U.S. Spent time in Central America interviewing sex traffickers and other human traffickers in the prison setting in Central America. Also did a lot of work in South America with Interpol, specifically in Bogota, Colombia, where I've gone down and I've heard the stories firsthand in terms of what's going on with human trafficking. And I take that information and I deliver it to those that can make a difference. So, my partner, Ali, is going to introduce herself in a second. Her and I, we spent a lot of time creating awareness around the country. We're going actually to all 50 states to provide human trafficking awareness training. We've also served as a consultant to committees on both the U.S. Congress and Senate side a total of 9 times in the last year about our research on human trafficking. Ali, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. So my name is Ali Hopper. My journey into researching human trafficking began in 2008. I've studied both domestic trafficking and the horrific realities of people being smuggled into the U.S. from beyond our borders. My work on the ground at the southwest border on both the U.S. and Mexican sides has shown me firsthand brutal, calculated operations of cartels who treat human lives as mere commodities. In prisons across the U.S. and abroad, I've sat face to face with traffickers, hearing their cold confessions, all while knowing the deep, lasting pain that they've inflicted on countless victims. Like Jarrod mentioned, we've been to the border in California. We've been to Central American countries. We've been to prisons in Latin American countries and interviewed traffickers. We've seen a live border crossing, and all of our research is firsthand experiences that we've had with researching this horrific crime.
Wow. I doubt that the viewers will ever find anybody more experienced in helping to prevent human trafficking than the two of you. So we really appreciate everything you're doing. So let's get going here. I would say, Dr. Jarrod, could you please tell us about the landscape, the current landscape? Give us a few statistics. And then at the same time, could the both of you feel free to interact together and ask each other questions, and then I'll join in when needed. Thank you.
So human trafficking is one of the largest humanitarian issues of our lifetime. It is far deeper and a far deeper issue than people realize. It is in communities throughout the United States. All 50 states have human trafficking, and most commonly is sex trafficking, but it involves any type of forced labor, right? So domestic servitude, working in deplorable conditions without proper pay and without the ability to leave those conditions. That's human trafficking. So what we're going to talk about today is human trafficking. We're talking about the border, but I really want to emphasize that the most significant amount of trafficking exists within the United States involving U.S. citizens. So sex trafficking, the vast majority of victims are in fact U.S. citizens. This occurs through grooming through the internet. And what happens is people go onto the internet that are traffickers, they look for vulnerabilities. As soon as they see those vulnerabilities, they begin to groom and entice people. So, for example, if a child goes onto the internet and says that no one understands them or they hate their parents, and they vent on the internet and they say things like that in social media, on gaming platforms, that's gold to traffickers. That's what they're looking for. And as soon as they see that, they begin to exploit that by developing a persona that will be attractive to that person, right? So they'll go and they'll research that person's social media profile, see what what their interests are, and they'll create a persona around that person's interest, and they'll basically gain the trust of that person to the point that they compel the person to ultimately meet with them. So, Ali, can you talk a little bit about anti-grooming in Florida and the need for legislation in terms of strengthening our laws?
Yeah, so actually it was interesting. The legislation was brought to me as an amendment from a mother that was working hard in Illinois to amend their grooming law. So Illinois has had a grooming law on the books since 2012. They brought the amendment to me to see what I could do. And I realized very quickly that we didn't have a grooming bill on the books. And so there was nothing to amend as far as longevity of someone's sentencing and stuff and items like that. So what we did was we looked at the criminal code. We realized that there was a major gap in the criminal code, that there was a gap between when you lure and entice a child, you're already past the grooming stage, you're already past the manipulation stage. And to take a step back, grooming in this sense, in the sense of the bill, is that it is adult to minor sexual grooming. And what this does is that's that manipulation, that inappropriate communication and conduct that happens between an adult with a minor as defined by the individual state. And so law enforcement can't intervene. They can't step in. And you know more than anybody as being a law enforcement officer, you can't step in unless there's a luring and enticing component, unless there's child pornography or some sort of obscenity that's being enacted. So as far as just simple communication, a text message, a voicemail, if you were acting inappropriately as an adult with a minor, law enforcement really couldn't do much. And so we worked hard to develop language to implement and get the anti-grooming bill signed by the governor. And now it's a felony 3.
Mm-hmm. And you've been able to take that legislation and pass it in multiple states. And, that really, it reflects the importance of, and we'll talk a little bit later about what people can do to get involved, but looking at the anti-trafficking legislation is really important. And it doesn't have to be, just our state representatives. It could be anyone, right? So we have a problem, within the United States in terms of grooming on the internet, our children going onto the internet, expressing vulnerabilities, being taken advantage of. But we also have a problem that's going through the southwest border. And a lot of Ali and I's work has been focused on what's going on at the southwest border. And we come at this from an apolitical view. We don't bring politics into this. We look at this as a humanitarian crisis. And I want to share, with our audience a little bit about what we're seeing down on the border. So we were on the border in February and had the opportunity to go into a shelter, a migrant shelter. So what happens right now is that people that come through the southwest border, if they have family and they have money, then they go to their final destination. If they don't, they're often taken to shelters. And I was in one of those shelters and I was hearing the voices of these victims that had been smuggled and trafficked to the United States. And what I heard was horrifying. I spoke to one individual named Alan from Peru. He explained that him and his family had been kidnapped by the Sinaloa cartel, taken to where they could have money sent to them via Western Union, and therefore they were able to live. They were actually kidnapped twice on that journey. I spoke to another individual that saw 2 people murdered because they had no money for bribes. But the saddest story was a mother who was in the shelter and refused to let her child out of her arms. And hours went by that she refused to let this child out of her arms. And when the staff said, well, why don't you set your child down and let your child play with the other children? You're safe here. You're in a shelter. She explained that the cartel, specifically the Scorpion cartel, which is a faction of the Gulf cartel, that the cartel not only stole all of her belongings, but also the other 2 children that she started the voyage with because she had no money for bribes. And then that made us wonder, well, why would cartels want children? Why are they stealing? Why are they kidnapping children? And Ali, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so basically why these cartels want children is to implement these processes that we're already seeing with sex and labor trafficking. They are able to acquire these children and be able to smuggle them across the border and have them owe a debt to these cartels and gangs and work off that debt, whether it be through sex acts or labor.
Mm-hmm. And what we found, so Ali and I have gone into the prison setting in Central America, and we've talked to people that are currently incarcerated, that were formerly incarcerated. We've talked to people that were incarcerated in the United States and then deported back to their home country in Central America. And what they've explained to us in terms of how human trafficking actually occurs and what traffickers understand about human trafficking and how that differs from the general public and certainly from law enforcement is horrifying. And we've learned that coyotes will embed themselves with migrant groups, and they'll identify themselves as a migrant even though they're actually working for the smuggler group, and they'll identify people that don't have the money for unexpected expenses, whether that be additional bribes, whether that be weather delays. And as soon as they find somebody that is unable to pay additional money, that person is sold over to the traffickers that work side by side with the smugglers. And what we found was we spoke to one individual that he was a sex trafficker. He was part of the Sinaloa cartel. He was a member of a Southern California prominent gang. And he explained, prior to his incarceration, and he explained that when somebody is brought to the United States and they're being trafficked, they're taken to stash houses. And because he worked inside a stash house, he was able to give us insight that no one else can give us. And for example, he told us that stash houses work in a pattern of three. The first stash house that victims of trafficking are taken to when they're brought to the United States acts as a processing center. There, the victims are photographed, a file is created that lists all of their demographic information, who their family is, where their family lives, and also how much money they need to work in order to pay off their trafficking debt. From there, they're often brutalized. There's somebody that's typically made an example of. And from there, they're taken to the second house. The second house is where the actual exploitation occurs. In the case of women, unfortunately, that's commonly sex trafficking. In the case of men, that's commonly drug packaging. They stay in that second house and endure that exploitation until their debt is paid. Then they're sent to the third house. And it's at third house that they're given back their property. They're actually treated with dignity, and arrangements are made to their final destination. But here's the thing, is that second house where the actual exploitation is occurring, that's not on the border. That's in my community. That's in your community. That's in communities throughout the United States. And it is a well-organized transnational criminal operation that these guys, the cartels down in Mexico, and then the gangs in the United States that are facilitating this, they communicate, they work together on this. And in fact, and when I testified before the United States Senate in July, I explained to them that everything is cloud-based. So all of the communication between the gangs and the transnational criminal organizations in the United States and the money that they're sending and all of the paper trail, it's all on the cloud. So it's all cloud-based. So that's one place that law enforcement really needs to get better at in terms of investigating and looking into. So, as we look at this, there are gangs that are uprising, that are growing in strength and that are creating havoc in the United States. Ali, can you share with us about one specific gang that comes to mind that is a growing threat in the United States?
Yeah, so we've heard it on the news many times, but the name of this specific gang is Tren de Aragua, and that is also known as TDA. So when you hear TDA, that's the gang that we're referring to. That gang is far more powerful and dangerous than people realize. They're a gang that was originated out of Venezuela, and they're more like a terrorist organization than a gang. They seek refuge in Venezuelan communities within the United States that protect them. And they're in many locations, more than what the news is actually reporting. They're ruthless. They have no qualms with jumping into any industry, whether that's drugs, sex, human, arms. So there's no standards. And it's basically, like I had already articulated, a terrorist organization.
That's a great point. So 5 years ago, I was asked to go to Central America and to speak on counter human drug trafficking and counter human trafficking. And prior to that trip, I had watched this Netflix documentary titled "The World's Toughest Prisons," and I learned about this country's prison. And this prison, what really set it apart for me is, and my faith is very important to me. So, what really set this prison apart from other prison and settings and other criminal justice settings around the world is that this entire prison is operated on a Christian-based operating model, and as a result, it has one of the lowest reoffending rates in the world. And what really stands out to me is this is a poor prison in a poor country. And when I was there to go and speak on counter drug trafficking and human trafficking, I was invited to come and see the prison. And when I walked around that prison, I saw true change. I saw a true rehabilitation. I saw things that are really working. And this prison, when I came home, I couldn't sleep at night. I knew there was something more that I needed to be doing. So for the last 5 years, I've been leading teams down to this prison, and we've been providing training to not only the staff, but also to the inmates. We've been providing life skills training, how to be a father when you're incarcerated, how to manage anger, things of that nature. And the result of that is that we've been able to gain the trust of many of the inmates. Why that's relevant to this discussion is some of those inmates are in there for human trafficking. So Ali and I are now, we're partners, and we go now into this prison, and we go and we talk to these people, and we sit at a desk across from, and we look into the eyes of murderers and sex traffickers. Ali, what stands out to you the most about our research and our work down there in the prison?
Obviously the faith-based component of it, it's really transformative. Whether you believe in or have a faith or not, it has shown that it's working. I mean, in that show that you said, the guy that went into the prison is an atheist, and he went out and he was just astounded at the recidivism rate and how much it's lowered and how little per prisoner that they pay, but how much value faith brings into that. But what I wanted to highlight about, I guess, the trafficking piece, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, was that it does affect all communities. Unless you plan on getting rid of trains, planes, and automobiles, every state is a border state. These migrants are coming in across the border, and actually they are now also coming in across the Canadian border. So northern states, the Canadian border is also an issue. But specifically focusing on the southern states, they are being transported via plane. We were on a plane ride with an unaccompanied child. We have seen migrant children being transported through our everyday, plane industry, airline industries like Delta, American, Southwest. There's no bounds as far as how they're getting migrants into the country. And then once they're there, their sponsors are whatever they give Border Patrol. They give them a name and a number, and there's no verification on the sponsor, their background, where they live. Many times it's been in an open field. There was a case where a child was delivered to a known MS-13 gang member. So this is an issue. And we went to a presentation a couple of weeks ago in one of the northern states, and we brought the Office of Refugee Resettlement data and showed them how many migrant children have been sent to their small state. And they were absolutely astounded.
That's a great point. So this time last year, if you would have told me, or if you would have asked me, what is the unaccompanied child program, I would have had no clue. But whenever I heard in February about this mother that her two children were taken from her by the cartels, and I asked myself why. And you and I have interviewed traffickers and asked that exact question, and the answer has been given to us that it's because there is a market in the United States for children, which is horrifying, but it's a fact. So the cartels are always one step ahead of law enforcement. Let's be real. And what they've realized is that they can take these children from parents in Latin America, Central America, South America. They could take these children and bring them to the border.